Okay, so after wrapping up the previous video, I couldn't help but noodle over the Markan Priority issue, and I thought I'd spend a little more time to hopefully illustrate why Markan Priority is a shockingly bad historical conclusion. And so I want to play a little more of this video and then get into just a quick summary as to why that is. Again, I'll do more on this, but we'll start with this video and go from there.
And what were the last words of Jesus? Like, what is most likely what Jesus, what was most likely his last words? And the reason I put it that way is because, like, I mean, as you know, the four Gospels don't agree with each other about what Jesus supposedly said, what his last words supposedly were.
Yeah.
So, are we supposed to just default to what Mark says, or is there additional criteria that's utilized to try to sort out which one of them is?
So again, this is where I left off in the last video, and if you're seeing this video first, just note the numerous kind of unsubstantiated assumptions that were put into the question as it was framed. And I don't want to parse that question so much. Let's just accept, for the sake of argument, that this is a skeptical point of view. But just note the assumptions that are put in there. Scholars all agree that Jesus' testimony doesn't agree with itself, and all this other stuff. And just ask yourself where this comes from. Again, we'll explore this later, but let's go on.
Is authentic.
Well, the argument for defaulting to Mark, I guess, would be because it's the earliest account. But it doesn't strike me that that's a very convincing argument, because even though Mark is the earliest, he's still 40 years later, being written by somebody who didn't know Jesus and wasn't there, and probably didn't know anybody who knew Jesus. So he's writing in a different language and living in a different part of the world. And so it's not a great source for something like this, because it's very problematic. I mean, the last words of Jesus would be the last things he says on the cross. Well, how many of his followers were there?
Okay. Folks, I just cannot express how difficult it is to deal with every flaw in the arguments that were just put forth. There's just so much there that is historically ungrounded. Again, it could be true. The argument is not that what Professor Ehrman is saying isn't true. The argument is that it's an unfounded hypothesis based on purely speculative reasoning, and the linchpin for that reasoning is this fictitious and erroneous placement of Mark as the first of the canonical Gospels. And so what I want to do here is I want to start with just outlining the assumptions we'd have to make in order to put Mark first. So I'll assume many of you are familiar with the principle of Occam's razor, but even that's often misunderstood and botched. So I'll just quickly take a second to essentially say, in the simplest terms that I can, what it means. So it means that if we're building a proof for an argument, any argument that relies on assumptions, we should prefer the argument that relies on the fewest assumptions to make that proof true. If we see deer footprints in the snow, we should favor the argument that a deer left them there over the argument that, say, a man wearing stilts with boot-shaped feet put them there instead. This principle is not meant to say what's definitively true. In fact, the man on stilts is possibly true, but rather, not knowing anything else, we abductively should favor the explanation that doesn't require us to compound assumptions. This is generally accepted as the proper framework for almost any other area of the academy, except for some bizarre reason, religious studies. And so I wanted to go into the assumptions that we need in order to adopt Markan Priority, because it helps illustrate just how preposterous that position is. And again, I've done deeper dives on this in other videos, and the quick summary here is that there's an argument that there's an intrinsic reason to believe based on looking at the texts of the Gospels themselves, that Mark came before Matthew and Luke for just so many reasons. That analysis is debunked. It's flawed. Again, you can see my other videos. You can see many other people have done work on this. I don't want to imply that I'm the only person who's ever done this work. But the argument here is that the Gospel of Mark is intrinsically first because the data that scholars purport to look at about portions of Mark being in Matthew and Luke, etc., somehow indicate that Mark was first, and so all the other arguments that point against that have to be overlooked. And so let's look at what the different assumptions you'd have to make in order to accept this as being true. Now, again, the intrinsic case is not accurate. It's flawed. It's actually terribly logically flawed. It's so bad that I'm flabbergasted that this continues to get the support that it does. But let's look at the assumption. So first, concerning Matthew, all we'd have to accept is that the historical texts, example, Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, and others that place Mark first aren't lying. That's all we'd have to accept. That those texts that place Matthew first and place Matthew ahead of Mark and Luke, that they weren't lying. And then we'd have to argue that Mark could have known Matthew and possibly Luke and elected to write a shorter gospel for whatever reason. Say a shorter gospel to be read aloud to non-Jews, or any other motivation that the author of Mark may have had to write a shorter gospel. So just two things. The historical testimony that came from, at least two independent sources that says Matthew was first didn't lie, and that Mark could have had a motivation to write a shorter gospel after seeing Matthew and or Luke and chose to do that. That's all we'd have to accept for the hypothesis that Matthew is first. Now, let's look at Mark. For Mark to be first, we'd have to accept that, one, the historical text of Irenaeus of Lyon lied or was inaccurate or made up the story or it's false. Two, that the historical testimony of Clement of Alexandria is a lie or made up or erroneous or false. Three, that all the other historical texts that came later that also corroborated these same positions, that those also lied and or were false or made up or erroneous. Then four, that the gospel attributed to Matthew the apostle, purported to be an eyewitness, would have had to copy texts, including text of Matthew's decision to follow Jesus, from Mark, who was not an eyewitness. Okay? Five, that Matthew, which is widely regarded as the most Jewish or Semitic of the canonical Gospels, would have had to adapt from the more Gentile-focused Mark to this older and heavily Jewish form, even though the rest of the Jesus movement, at the time scholars are saying Mark was written, was moving away from that. If Matthew was first, this wouldn't be required. And then so six, Matthew would have included Semitisms in his gospel, all of which contain translations. Again, even though the audience that Mark was allegedly writing to was earlier and would have been least likely to need those translations. Now, understandably, if you're saying Mark is way, way late and everything's late, then maybe those translations would have made sense. But then the use of Semitisms by Mark can't then also be used as an argument for why Mark was first. I hope that makes sense. And so, seven, for some scholars, an additionally hypothetically created document referred to as Q, again, another topic for another time, which is no longer extant, must have existed and served as the source of the shared content between Matthew and Luke that doesn't appear in Mark. Because again, Matthew and Luke share content that is not in the Gospel of Mark. Though they're longer Gospels and they contain stuff that's not found in Mark. And so scholars over the years have hypothesized that there's this long lost document called Q that both Matthew and Luke would have needed to draw on. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with postulating a hypothetical document like that. If the argument requires us to have that, then it's perfectly valid to put it in there. But again, we can get to an argument that does not require Q. One by putting Matthew first, and another by the fairer analysis, which professors like Mark Goodacre use, that has Mark first, but then Luke depending on Matthew. Again, another conversation. So we could get to hypotheses that don't require us to use Q, and so Q is still, however, the dominant accepted framework for Markan priority by most Markan prioritists, even today. The fairer argument is still the minority viewpoint amongst Markan prioritists. And then I think it's 7 or 8, we do believe that although they both use Q, Matthew and Luke couldn't have known the other. Again, this is required for the Q hypothesis. To be fair, the fairer hypothesis doesn't argue this, but the argument is that Q would have had to circulate widely enough and been authoritative enough for both Matthew and Luke to rely on and use it, but for there to be no mention or evidence of it since, and where both Matthew and Luke weren't aware of one or the other's gospel. And they're probably, I'm sure, in fact, I'm kind of doing this off the cuff, so there are certainly numerous other arguments and assumptions that have to be believed in order for us to accept Markan priority. But just take those, right? And just, again, applying Occam's razor to this conclusion that Mark must have been first. And this is not a conclusion that is debated or contested or wrestled with amongst the Religious Studies Academy. You saw here Professor Ehrman and his host just spouting it as if it's foregone conclusion, as if it's fact. Again, it's widely regarded that this is one of the few issues that is settled and not debated. And you ask yourself, how could a so-called academic environment allow for such an assumption-laden, deeply, deeply flawed argument for something this important to become so foundational? And you see from this text what flows from that. If Mark is first, then, as stated earlier, we know Mark is not a eyewitness. There's no testimony that Mark was an eyewitness, or at least the bulk of the testimony doesn't support that. Then there's the dating argument, which has its own set of flaws and its own issues, which we can discuss at another time, that pushes Mark way past the period that would likely encompass the period of time of eyewitnesses. Professor Ehrman says Mark didn't know Jesus and likely didn't know anyone who was a witness to Jesus. Again, all based on this. And then from that, even the parts of Mark that you might use to possibly say these were the last words of Jesus is discredited because Mark is so late. It's not based on eyewitness testimony. It's the document that was relied on by the other gospels, and all these other kind of flawed arguments that flow from it. So it is a really important issue to get right, and we need to hold the Religious Studies Academy accountable for exactly where they are getting this from and why. All of the arguments that I've seen and heard have been thoroughly discredited. I've done it, others have done it. And I encourage you, if you've not done so, to go look at the arguments. And I'm happy to address arguments that I may have missed. But the two chief arguments that it doesn't really make sense for Mark, if he was the third of the canonical gospels to be written, to have the profile that he did with the things that he left out and so forth. That's just a weak and discredited argument. All the arguments from order that predated, that led to all of this, those are all discredited. And then, of course, this editorial fatigue argument that's put forth by Professor Goodacre, who I totally respect and think very, very highly of, but it's just flat out wrong on editorial fatigue. It's a terrible argument. It's logically circular. It requires us to have the view of what we consider first ahead of time. And it's also reversible and has a bunch of other issues. Again, I've done other videos on this. Those are the arguments I'm aware of for Mark being first. And they rely on us accepting all of these other assumptions that we wouldn't have to accept if we just went with the simplest and most logical explanation, which is that the historical testimony that puts Matthew first, there's no reason to not believe it. So again, I'll wrap up there. I felt this was maybe a little bit rambly, but I just needed to get this out there because this is such an important point that almost all religious studies scholarship hinges on. And I think it's important for us, if we're going to hold the Religious Studies Academy accountable, that they give us a really good reason for why we should accept all these assumptions and accept this deeply flawed argument of Markan Priority. So I'll stop there, and maybe we'll spend some more time on this video in a future video. Thanks.